we're joined today some great contacts from around the world of communications to talk about culture and working on cultural cross communications. Annabel.
Yep. Lovely. So we're just going to introduce our guests very briefly, and I'll just ask them one quick question before we delve into some deeper interviewing. So Lara in New York, if you'd like to give us a wave, an Aussie in New York. And so Lara is one of Forbes's 30 under 30 in 2019 in marketing and advertising. She's the founder of Publicist, the online marketplace connecting freelance PR and marketing professionals. So really interesting model and going great guns in the US, as I understand it. Of course, we have to start by wishing you a very happy Thanksgiving, and slight cultural confusion on our part because we failed to realize it was Thanksgiving today. So thank you so much for making time. And first question to you, do you have a turkey in the oven, and is it self-basting? Is it going to be all right for the next hour?
The turkey is fine. It's out on the counter right now, but it will go into the oven as soon as I'm off this. But it'll be a great meal, lots of sides and delicious pies.
Fantastic, great.
It's all round to yours then, is it? We're also joined by Ruby Thapar, who is a communications leader from India. You're currently in Mumbai. Give us a wave, Ruby, so we can all see you. Ruby's experience includes working with major international companies, including the US chemical giant Dow, and where she was a director of corporate affairs. And your patch was massive, wasn't it? Because it covered as far north as Turkey, bits of Middle East, as well as India, obviously. So, so that's a fairly wide patch. And you covered public affairs, CSR, crisis, advocacies. So she's well versed in seeing things through multiple cultural lenses. Welcome, Ruby. I'm just curious, Ruby, do you think communicators are becoming more or less aware of cultural nuance in their work?
Yes and no. I think in India, we grow up in diversity. So I think the cultural nuances are ingrained from a very young time. But I think the world is still getting to know India. I'm speaking from an Indian perspective, but increasingly, I think cultures are being taken into account. People are trying to understand what the cultures are, but I believe there's still a long way to go.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah. Well, so welcome, Ruby.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we have the wonderful Melanie Chevalier, and delighted to have met Melanie a few years ago. Thanks for the wave. And as an anthropologist, that was my training. I was fascinated by what Mel had done to set up her business, which is a cross-cultural consultancy. So Mel's the person to go to. Do you mind me calling you Mel? Is that okay? Cool. And from her background, having been raised in Taiwan, Brazil, Cameroon, Spain, and France, and a French native, but now living in London, she set up a business that really helped brands to understand what happens across borders and to understand the nuances. And there's some fascinating stuff on her website. I really recommend going to have a look at that. And we'll be coming on to wonderful things like trans creation, which I'm dying to hear more about from you. But just to kick off, would you say you're seeing a stronger interest in awareness of cultural differences as we go into 2021?
I think so, actually. Hi, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, morning, depending where you are. There is definitely, at least in the UK, since the beginning of the pandemic, I think, and it happened in the US as well with the BLM movement that has resurged over the last few months. I think there is more and more of an awareness, and it's great to see when someone like us, you know, people like us have been on educational journeys to try and make people aware that these are really important to take into consideration when communicating. I think the shift this year has been very much looking at a domestic level as opposed to international. So at least from our perspective, a lot of the work used to come from international markets and managing cross-cultural communications between countries, where I think the focus now is brands are realizing that within, you know, their companies and within their communications externally and internally, there is a huge amount of diversity from the different communities in the countries that they have to be very aware of and cater for. So I think there has been a shift, but as Ruby was saying, there is still a lot to be done.
Fantastic. Well, really looking forward to hearing from you. And I should mention your company name, Creative Culture. So thanks. We'll dive into some of those issues when we come on to interviewing you. But first of all, we're going to start with Lara.
Oh, well, actually, 1 second before we go on. This one thing we were going to do. We were going to ask the audience how culture matters in their roles as communicators, because that obviously is going to help our panel, isn't it, to understand a little bit better of where people are coming from. So in the chat box, could you just take a second or two to actually just type in the answer? How does culture matter in your role as a communicator now, just so we can tailor a little bit of some of the answers that we give today. Just type in.
Fabulous.
So let's see what people are typing. We didn't warn you we were going to wear your fingers out if you come on this conversation today. So let's see how it matters.
I think we've caught a few people out who are multitasking, Liam. They're probably doing something else as we chat. But I'm going to kick off whilst comments are coming in to ask you, Lara, first, if I may. So to give us the US perspective, really. So let's say from a US perspective on employee engagement in particular, do you see that's very different from the things you're hearing already today?
Yes, I'm off mute. Look, I think that it's such an interesting and important time to be having these conversations. I think 2020 has been a year of globally, but particularly in the US, we have just had an incredibly divisive election. Black Lives Matters movement is one of the most important narrative of 2020 and beyond. And then obviously we're in the middle of a global pandemic. So I think that, both culturally and politically, from a brand and communication standpoint, companies need to have a stance. And I think that that's one thing that kind of has been swept under the rug before. And so that really ties into employee engagement, particularly, highlighting COVID. I think that right now we are in a position where people fear for their jobs on a day-to-day basis. I think that's one thing that is probably, happening more and more in the US, just statistically, with layoffs. I think it's up like 20% at the moment. I think the other thing that's probably worth noting is America has the largest population of Gen Zs in the world, and this is such an interesting demographic. And while they're not the predominant demographic in the workforce, in the next 5 years they will be, and they're digital first, and they are wildly vocal, and they really demand this constant employee engagement. And they care about things like they're very ethically focused, and they're very transparent. And so I think the US, yes, we are probably seeing it particularly under a microscope, but what Ruby and Mel said as well, we're definitely seeing that too.
And can you describe any, I suppose, war stories, I might call them, any challenging situations you've had to deal with in handling where there's been a cultural nuance?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the US, and I think it's quite different to the UK and definitely Australia, is people take health benefits in America very, very seriously. The last company before founding Publicist I worked for, I ran internal communications there, and we looked to change the company's health benefits for a commercial, deal that was going to benefit the company, but in turn it would affect employees, and we did not handle it well. I mean, just to give context, in the US, a lot of people will commit to jobs because health benefits are fantastic. And I think, it's a really important thing. And we did a terrible job of communication around the change and the implementation. And it was you know, a really difficult situation to be in. And we didn't do a great job. We completely rectified it, but I think you really lose employees' trust when you do things like that. And trust is the number one, you know, thing that employees now look for. And I think, you know, companies that possess that as a value leads to higher retention in terms of, you know, happier employees, better output, and so forth. And so that's something, look, we totally butchered it, but that's probably an example that's super specific to the US.
Okay, interesting. Yes, the health benefits, I'm sure that's a huge red button topic with the cost and so forth to American citizens.
It really is. And just to kind of give an example, it's about, you know, out of pocket, it can be $2,000 a month. So it's, you know, it's serious money we're talking about.
Yeah. And what about particularly around how internal comms teams work? And what would you say the trends are in terms of working? We've talked pre this call a little bit about external contractors and particularly for business around supplying freelance into the internal comms team. Can you paint a picture of how the US handles that and what you think the trends are?
Yeah, so I think a trend with internal communications is the relationship between internal comms and HR and talent has never been closer. I think it's almost a unit that needs to work as a silo. And we're seeing instances where comms is actually now reporting into the chief HR officer or whatever it may be. Just for context on my business Publicist. So, you know, as Annabel mentioned, we connect brands with talent, with freelance talent, and we're a marketplace where everything happens on the platform. Some things that we saw earlier this year was that brands that didn't necessarily have dedicated in-house specialists were hiring experts for project-based internal communications work. And this is something, you know, you wouldn't expect people to hire contractors for because internal communications really requires this legacy knowledge of a company. But we're seeing, you know, really around June and July, we were seeing employee engagement, internal relations, investor relations, really to kind of, you know, hire contractors to build this function out and educate teams that might be a little more generalist, which is really interesting. Like in my, you know, it was a surprise to me. A lot of times on the platform, we see things like brand marketing or performance marketing or content or traditional public relations, perhaps functions that, you know, you're able to be caught up to speed much quicker. But I think that's a huge trend, seeing, you know, people outsourcing for internal comms.
Do you think that was a direct response to the changes with COVID, with staff being perhaps furloughed or having to downsize teams with the economic pressure?
Absolutely. And I think that, you know, this year it's been so interesting to see month by month what people are hiring for. And I think, you know, we touched on this in our prep call that in May, we were seeing brands hiring for virtual events, crisis communications. And then, you know, over summer, we were really just seeing people want to invest more and more internally in their teams around alignment. You know, how do you create these cultural and political stances? Like, these are topics that brands have never had to come out and, you know, give their opinion on before. And it's now just absolutely expected. It's not a nice to have, it's a necessity. And so yes, it's COVID related.
If we bring it back to the main topic of today around cultural confusion or comms clarity, in those briefs, are you seeing a requirement for understanding of cultures beyond the States or out of states within the States?
No, we are seeing them fairly localized, to be honest. A really kind of deep knowledge on skill set and industry is probably, yeah, the focus where, yeah, so no.
Okay, so quite a US-centric approach to recruitment.
It is.
Yeah,
it is.
Okay, interesting.
Exactly.
Liam, there's been a lot of chat coming through on the chat. Is there anything to chip in to Lara here?
I thought, well, actually, one of the things that I don't know if Lou wants to speak, but Lou made the point with in the chat box. It's important that we recognise how much behaviours and cultures have changed in the workplace and outside since the start of COVID. Is that and that's quite an important point, isn't it? It has done a lot to change our cultures, hasn't it? Did you want? Did I get that right, Lou?
Yeah, absolutely. I was only talking with colleagues today about we had a staff survey has just been launched, because we've been surveying our staff every couple of months throughout COVID to assess how they're doing, how they're coping, if they've got the support they need to do their role, and such like. And yeah, we're seeing complete turnarounds in some attitudes and behaviours. Some of the staff that we actually sat there and thought, these folks are going to wig out at these changes that we're bringing in, and they're going to need some extra support, have actually just rolled with it. And others who we previously thought of as quite level-headed and quite chilled out have not coped so well. And we're seeing that across the whole business, not just in terms of managing what's going on with COVID, but how they're actually doing their jobs and how they're responding to our customers and how they're dealing with them. There's generally a much deeper understanding of what our customers are going through and how much more they need from us. And I think generally, culturally, we've become less of an organised, even though we're a local government, so, you know, we have services that we have to deliver. We've probably become as much counsellors and mentors for our customers as anything else, because you get people on the phone still complaining that their bins haven't been emptied or that they're paying too much on their council tax, but they're also going, life's really hard at the moment, you know, I can't afford my council tax, and I've got this, that and the other going on. And before you know it, you're having some quite in-depth conversations with customers about some very personal circumstances, and it's become something different. And our staff have always been very good at that, but they are taking even more time now to listen to those customers. And afterwards, and I'm so pleased about this, they're having some proper reflection time about those customers as well. They're not just phone down, bang on to the next one. They're actually talking to each other and going, this is what I'm hearing from people today, and this is how they're feeling. And perhaps we could be doing more and helping them on that kind of thing. And it's fabulous to see. It's such a dire situation where we're seeing people really, really struggling, like you say, not knowing if they're going to have a job, if they're going to be able to pay the bills. They are turning to their local council for help in ways that we've always wanted them to do. And it sadly took a global health pandemic for that to happen. But the way our staff have responded has been fab. So I've actually said to colleagues today, we have to just throw all our preconceptions about our staff and the way they behave out the door at the moment. And we need to start from scratch.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to do.
No, absolutely. And I think teams as well, like we're dealing with huge issues here around, you know, isolation and motivation and mental health and physical health. And then there's, you know, an equality and inclusion piece. But I think around the mental health, like, you know, I have people in my team who are in 1,000 square foot apartment with 4 other people, and like that is challenging. And then you have, you know, team members with kids and with schools starting and stopping and starting and stopping. I mean, it's from a mental health perspective, like it's a really, really hard year, you know, for communicators, for employees. And so I think, yeah, it's a really tough time. It is.
We've seen a comment earlier on from Nicola. I think you're in Ireland working for SAP. I don't know if you want to wave and put your camera on, or whether I can ask your question for you. Let me know if you want to say it. Can't see you coming on. So Nicola says, yes, do unmute.
Hi, Nicola. Good to see you.
Hi, Liam. I'm hiding in the dark here, Annabel.
You mentioned a comment further up about understanding. Do you want to play that back to Lara or to the gathered crowd?
Oh yes, so I think that was from I was listening to what Ruby was saying about the different cultures and stuff. So obviously, and listening to Lara about this connection between communications and HR. So I'm in the team that are HR communications. So we're inside HR, but we have another kind of communications arm who are not within HR. They're in the CEO office area. So it's to see that kind of the difference there, but from a HR perspective, we can see how different programs apply across the board in different ways. And also again with this pandemic, we see divisions too, with some employees rushing and really want to get back to the office, whereas others are like, yeah, no, I'm fine to work from home forever and ever. And then you've got this kind of balance, and it's trying to see where it fits, because like I think Lou, you'd said that you kind of monitored what was happening. We did that as well. We did remote work pulses every kind of 6 weeks to see how people were doing. And it was amazing. We were amazed with the participation rates. They were much higher than we would have ever expected, because people had something to say and they wanted to share it. And whether it was somebody in Dublin who wanted to get their laptop or their screen for their laptop to work from home, or somebody in the US who wanted to get their chair. They were coming through with all of these different things. So it's an appreciation of where it's all at. So
I think for all the negatives of COVID, there have been some fantastic positives in people opening up, and there being much better collaboration and creativity, and people really saying what's going on for them and changing that whole business vibe, and people opening up more, which has been really interesting to see. Stephen, you've put a comment in the side panel here agreeing with Lou. Do you want to come on and just expand on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it echoes a bit of what Nicola was just saying. I was working with a client and they had some kind of cultural problems in their organization. They had a UK office and a US office, and the two were kind of a bit at loggerheads. And suddenly everybody's on Zoom or Microsoft Teams, and they're all on an equal playing field now. And it doesn't matter whether they're in the UK or the US. And that's been a great dissolver of barriers, because everybody's on the same screen. And so that was a really positive thing. And then we did a little mini cultural survey with them. And one of the things we wanted to look at was leadership behavior and communication. So we put some questions on around, you know, how often have you had a conversation with your manager about strategy, about projects, about what's going on? And I added a trick question, which was, the last topic was just a general check-in with no agenda. And my hypothesis was the score on that would be quite low, but actually it was very high. And so managers were spending a lot of time just having chats with people, and, you know, echoing a bit of what Lou was saying and Nicola, around just getting to know people as individuals and making sure their mental health was okay. And I think the combination of that improved personal behavior from leaders, plus the equalizing effect of everybody working remote, has sort of transformed the way this organization works. And actually, you know, there's a lot of what they was forced upon them, they want to actually keep.
Excellent. Yes. Lara, anything else to add on
No,
that?
it's a great point. I think that, you know, organizational cohesion has become boundaryless this year, from countries to teams. And you know, it's proven that output is up. People are working harder. They're not commuting an hour into the office. And so I think, you know, finding that equilibrium and finding how to continue, whether it's a hybrid of in the office or at home. But I think that this idea of boundaryless work, it's not all remote work, but boundaryless is going to be a huge trend that we see going forward.
A great point from Lorna here, but I'm going to hand over to Liam, who's going to bring in Ruby. But we'll pick up on the point.
Yeah, it was quite interesting. The point about remote working is because Ruby and I have had a conversation a couple of times about sort of remote working in the Indian context, because it's a very different situation India's been through with COVID and people, you know, going home and not being in the office. It's a very different situation, isn't it?
I think it's pretty similar to what people are talking about, but there's also a fatigue about working from home. So people are now saying, I'm working at home rather than working from home, because you're not just doing the office work, you're managing so many other things while you're working from home. You know, you're managing the home, and we live in joint families. Our gender roles are very, very different as compared to others. I was on a panel on diversity the other day, and one of the points that we made was that everything's on the table. There's nothing, roles, children, to see how the spouses, how parents interact, you know, which job belongs in whose bucket. So there is, I mean, the good part is there is a shift that's going to come about. I think the next generation is going to redefine the roles of gender, at least in a country like India, where we've got very strict gender roles, you know, and maybe the alpha or the new generation is redefining the roles, but largely the roles of men and women are very fixed. And I also see I think while there's advantage that in a city like Mumbai, the commute is horrendous. You're spending sometimes more than 2 to 3 hours on the road just to get to work, and then you don't have the energy, which is a good part. You're getting time to spend with your family and children is very good, but you're also doing so much more and you're working more, which is causing stress. And I think I believe most women would like to go back to work because there's a sense of freedom. You get ready, you're doing, you know, your office, the boundaries are good in that sense. So I think people would look at a hybrid model where they have the flexibility of going back to work when they can and, you know, work from home. Maybe I don't think it'll ever go back to full-time work. I know a lot of companies are giving up real estate in Mumbai. Lots of offices have been emptied, and so we'll see how that goes. But it will redefine gender roles. It will redefine the way we work. It will redefine the relationship with work. It will create and set new cultures, is what I believe, you know, at least in the Indian context.
I was quite intrigued earlier on because you said something like, you know, Indians are brought up in what is a very diverse culture. I was wondering what you meant by that.
So there is no one Indian culture. You know, when people read about India and they think, oh, this is the Indian culture. But we have so many Indian, you know, we grew up in multitude. So while I studied in English, I've also learned 3 more languages as I'm growing up. So I have multitude of language, multitude of food, multitude of festivals, multitude of fabric. I mean, just about everything. So you grew up in diversity. I mean, the apartment building I live in has somebody from the south of the country, somebody from the north. I'm from the north of the country, but I'm born and brought up here, somebody from the east. And it could be an NRI, somebody from the US staying in the same building. So the culture just becomes diverse. You grow up with everything. You grow up with different religions. You grow up celebrating everything. And I think that gives us a very different mindset. So when you come to, you're more accepting of other cultures as compared, it is not as much effort. And I find we very seamlessly adopt and make the other person very comfortable. And that's why we are more hospitable, possibly, when we, and, you know, wanting to make them comfortable. So we will, because we know how diverse cultures could be, people could be attached to the way they work, and I think this nuance is not sometimes appreciated. People think there's one universal Indian culture. Actually, no, I think sometimes I feel like an, you know, non-resident Indian in my own country. If I go to the south of the country, I can't speak the language. I need a translator with me. So that's the sheer diversity within my own country. And that brings a very different dimension when you come to work. You're more accepting, more tolerant in that sense of a lot of things, good and bad. It has got pros and cons. Yeah.
But the gender thing is still quite a big issue in Indian work.
I think gender, religion, we have our set of issues for sure. Gender is big. I remember I studied in Bristol and I went back home. When I came back from there, and you know, I was treated very nicely. I had, you know, there was seamless gender. There were no such roles. And I came home and told my brother that, you know, you should also be doing this. And he says, listen, you're back in India. So it's going to take some time. That's how it is, but it's changing. I think women stepping out, you know, the economics is a strong force for social change. So I don't think social change is going to bring about economic force, but economic empowerment is going to bring about social change in the country. And that understanding is important there, that the more empowered women are economically, the more social change that will come about.
Now, you worked for a long time with Americans at Dow,
yes.
And you were telling me that there's kind of very different attitudes to work between sort of the American kind of workplace culture, the American corporate culture, and the Indian corporate culture. I thought that would be quite an interesting thing to talk about.
So, you know, one of the good things about Dow was that you go to any office of Dow anywhere in the world, it looks the same. So you feel you've got that. But I think the nuances, like somebody else was also talking about, are very, very subtle. And you got to respect that, and you got to learn that, you know. So when I got this regional role, I made the effort to understand, how does it work in Africa? How does it work in Middle East? How does it work in Turkey? How do the leaders treat? How do they like to be spoken? I remember I joined an Indian company and not Dow, and it was a culture shock for me. I worked in 2 Indian companies before I came to Dow, and there everybody was addressed as sir or Mr. So-and-so, and in Dow everybody was on first name, which was a culture shock for me. So within my own country, to move from from an Indian company to an American company is a culture shock. And then getting used to that in the American culture is also different. I think Americans are more direct, but sometimes I feel that the warmth is missing, and the Indians by nature would give, would offer. So I feel that's a gap.
And you were telling me about sort of attitude to things like autonomy, of, you know, giving people autonomy to get on with jobs versus giving them clarity. I
so,
thought
you know, yeah, so if you come to India, in our homes as well as workplace, you would find 3 generations. You'll have the baby boomers, you'll have the Gen Z, and you'll have the millenniums, or the, you know, and we all coexist together. We all work together. So autonomy, the Gen Z will, the millennium will just pick it up. Maybe the Gen X will also pick it up, but the baby boomers may not really want to. So when you are as a communicator, when you come from there, all the 3, can you have a common narrative which would appeal to everybody? You know, so so it's not true that we are hierarchical. Maybe it's partially true, but we would want autonomy. We want to be included. We want to, you know, be part of the decision-making process. But we will also maintain the boundaries in that sense. But yes, so it's partially true. We're evolving. And I think when you interact with them, my experience, when Americans came to India, they went back transformed, because they came with certain preconceived notions which were read over the internet. But when they come on ground and they see the reality, it's totally different. So the transformation is very, very different in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I found that, because we met last year when I was in India, and I found that sort of a massive change. One thing I did think was quite interesting, and I think Lorna's mentioned it in the chat box, about introversion and extroversion. And I think that's kind of quite, because within organizations you have these, you know, you can have kind of some functions which are kind of, you know, terribly introverted. I'm thinking about, you know, finance functions versus, you know, maybe sales functions and stuff. Is there, I mean, generally in your experience in India, is the sort of Indian workplace culture more introverted, more extroverted? What gets celebrated?
I think extroversion is celebrated universally, because the concept of leadership is very extroversion. But people are appreciating what the introverts bring. Dow was a science company, and all our scientists, we had a bunch of scientists. I think half the company was made of PhDs and doctors. You know, while the perception is that they would be introverted, but I found some fun scientists as well. So I think it's more personality driven than that. I don't think it's function driven. Indians by nature would be more observant, would not be very upfront in offering responses till asked. But you will also have the others who will be very assertive, and who will. So you know, so the diversity is available. So I don't know if I can box and say Indians are by nature introverted or extroverted. I think it's personalities. And you know, to Lara's point about HR and communications working together, you know, in Dow, India was the first country which actually had this strong relationship between HR and communications. Because when I joined the company was in total hibernation because of some of the external events that had happened. And to bring them out, we had to work together, and which actually became a template for globally, that how HR and comms can work together very successfully around employee engagement.
Yeah. I was going to ask, thanks, Lara. I was going to ask Lorna, what was your, is that in line with the point you were making before? Does that chime with you?
Yes, kind of. I guess the thought came to me when I was chatting to actually my partner one night after work, and he has a new person in his team who's really, really introverted. She's been onboarded during COVID, so doesn't have the opportunity to have those face-to-face relationship building kind of one-to-one sessions where you know, perhaps introverts are better at coming across, and you know, a team meeting like this for her would be incredibly challenging. She just wouldn't have the confidence to speak up. And I sort of chatted with a few other people in my own place about, you know, what about all these, you know, people that are just not, you know, don't want to have their, you know, name shouted out in a town hall, or, you know, how do we even know they're still engaged in working with us? Like, you know, our manager's really working hard enough to make sure they are, and if they're not, do they know how to? You know, we've been in this sort of extended work from home period for such a long time. I just have that fear that, you know, we've missed a trick here, where we've got this brilliant element of our workforce that we're perhaps ignoring a little bit. Maybe not intentionally, but that might be the case. And I was just interested to hear if anybody is really looking at, you know, how do we make sure we're still engaging with introverts, with you know, without actually the fear of going, hey, introvert, I want to engage with you, you know, that's kind of, you know, is it even possible? So just interested to hear anyone's views.
I think Lara commented in the chat box about that subject, didn't you, a second ago?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we're a tech, you know, we're essentially a tech company, we're a tech platform. And so a lot of our team members are engineers, and a lot of those engineers are introverted. They feel very comfortable behind a computer, behind a screen. And with channels like Slack, we really see them thrive, because that communication is incredibly direct. And I think, Ruby, you may have touched on it before, but with Americans, it's a very transactional communication. There aren't a lot of, you know, it's really, really direct. And so I think with channels that allow for virtual communications and efficiencies, we're seeing our introverts just absolutely thrive. And I think, you know, understanding with our onboarding, we're having people do like an archetypes, kind of like a Myers-Briggs test, so you can really understand people's strengths and their core competencies. And so when you play into those and really understand, you know, what their passions are, and tools like Slack have really, really helped us this year with communication. But it's interesting, and I just don't think we will ever go back to full-time work. Seeing how productive people are, we will absolutely have a hybrid of maybe it's a week of the month in the office, or is it 3 days a week? But I never think we'll return to an office full time.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
So,
in fact, Liam, in another forum that we were talking, in fact, the introverts do like to be nudged once in a while, because it's not that they don't want to engage, it's just that they don't draw energy from crowd. But they do want to be spoken to. They don't want to be checked upon. Hi, how are you doing? And can we do something? Maybe not as much as the extroverts. But I'm not sure if you can leave them completely alone. I think there would be mental health issues, which Lara has touched upon earlier.
Ruby, can I just finish up then by asking you one last question? Do you have any advice for Westerners coming to work in the East to cope with the culture? There we go.
Yeah, I think one or two maybe, yeah. So one I've already said is that you have to get used to the fact that we are 3 generations working together under one roof, and you know, how would you deal with them? Because it requires nuance and it's very different. The second is, while we speak English, you still need to do an English to English translation, because we also think in other Indian languages. And our English is very different from yours. And so I learned this term English to English translation when I was working for an American company, because the way I use English and the way I speak is more British, because we still have the influence of the British on the Indian language. And also I would have my version of English, which would have some Indian language flavor in it, you know. So I think understanding and that. Also, third is getting to know people, setting expectations. I think the relationship with work and growth is very different in India as compared to the Western culture. So if you can set that expectation as to why you're engaging with them. So while we would like you to engage with us and have coffees with us and have activities with us, but we eventually want to know what you have in it for me. And setting that expectation is extremely critical. I think we are very emotional about as far as our work is and our jobs are concerned. And that's a nuance which even I have learned as a leader and leading teams, that how people are very, very approach it very, very differently. I think the fourth thing that would be is that we want to be engaged. So while we don't sit in the epicenter, we feel like we are sitting in the island. We are more curious to know what's happening in the headquarters. How can we engage more with the headquarters?
Ruby,
and so if you
have to jump in, because I think your list gold dust, but I'm going to jump in because I'm really conscious of time.
Yes, sure. So absolutely. I realize Melanie has still not spoken.
I know.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so it's not fair.
Pop your points in the chat, because there's real gold dust in there, and I didn't want to cut you off, but I am conscious of time, so do drop them into the chat for us. I think it's really good. Mel, I'd love to come to you. Could you give us a very quick global overview of your take on cultural confusion? And I know you've got a lot to say, so over to you on that.
Sure. Well, from our perspective, obviously focusing on country cultures, I think, and working internationally, my take is that culture and cultures are very much of an afterthought, very often, sadly. So when I started the business 12 years ago, I came from a transcreation background. So for those who don't know what transcreation is, it's the adaptation of content in multiple languages or cultures, but ensuring that the message is conveyed as opposed to translated in the different cultural groups. And particularly working on external communications, one thing that I came to realize is that things were left very late in the process. So things would be developed centrally within headquarters. And then a lot of effort would be put into making sure that was really fine-tuned, worked really well, generally in English. And I know working for internal comms and HR, the company language will tend to be English across the board when it's international. And then suddenly the companies would just think, oh, it's fine, we'll deal with it at the end of the process. The markets can do it. It'll be translated. It'll be fine. And actually the result is that as much as you try and make an effort to adapt it and really make it work, if a concept doesn't work in a culture, it just doesn't work. And you can't wait until it's just about to be launched to think, oh, we need to translate and we need to adapt. So I think for me, my take on this is that the confusion that comes with the different cultures and the company culture as well, when it comes to international, is that it's very much left to the last minute. And that's when all these cultural faux pas happen, or disengagement with the teams, because whether it's internal or external, you're not showing to the local markets that you understand there's a real need to adapt. And they're always fighting. And this is what we're trying to do as a business, is to try and make both central and local meet, as opposed to there always be a conflict where the local markets or the local communities, if you're working on a domestic market, are always trying to preach for their work and why it's important to adapt.
Can you give us a couple of case studies or quick, again, war stories is the phrase I like to use, of experiences that you've had where clients did that very thing and you either retrieved the situation or had to come in and set them straight?
Well, luckily, we're there to avoid that, so I don't have so many war stories to share. But I think one example that was interesting, I guess, to this group is we recently published a white paper on gender inclusion across cultures. We're a woman on business certified by We Connect International, and obviously we really wanted to take this opportunity to sort of put forward that it's a very important topic, but as Ruby very, very rightly mentioned, it's one that you have to take with a lot of caution and nuancing, because when you work internationally, you cannot expect as a Westerner that every country is at the same level of understanding or same level of maturity around all those diversity and inclusion matters, including gender. And working on the white papers, I interviewed a few clients and came across really interesting insights that I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think about when they're trying to build their sort of inclusion policy and strategy. And a pharma company I spoke to was saying that in order to be inclusive, they had developed parental leave across all genders, sexual orientation, that would be both for men and for women. And they've implemented it across several continents. And when it came to the Americas, specifically men, they realized men were very reticent to take their parental leave. So there's a lot of stigmatization that was happening around this. And also them realizing that actually had been a barrier to a lot of women's career progression. So they didn't want to do it because they were in fear that this would happen to them as well. So by trying to implement something positive and inclusive, they actually got a lot of sort of challenges they were facing that were cultural and they hadn't necessarily thought about. And then another interesting one was a telco company who's mentioning that in Africa, their teams, for the same topic, actually parental leave, the teams were facing a cultural dynamic that the headquarters in the UK hadn't thought about, is that polygamy is actually quite a thing in some countries in Africa, and where some men have several wives and therefore can have several children during the same calendar year from different households. Gosh. And so they were having to think about how to sort of mitigate this, because they were wanting to be obviously inclusive, but also understanding logistically how that can work within certain areas where they were based in Africa.
Wow, gosh, yes, things you perhaps wouldn't think of instantly as a Westerner, but fantastic insight on those territories. Thank you. So what kind of advice would you give internal comms and comms professionals in particular when starting to think about an international market and how to plan to avoid those comms clashes?
Well, the first one, I guess, is quite obvious, is do your homework. and don't leave it until it's too late. Don't think about a framework thinking, oh, how would I think? What is logical? What is the best? Because again, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, for example, you have in your head what ranks the best and what is the right thing to do, obviously. So do your homework first, look at what's happening in the markets, survey with the people on the ground within your business, or get external providers to help you understand what that culture is about and what the priorities are on your topic and how people feel about it, to really feed your strategy at a global or central level first. The second one would be to involve the local markets or the local communities that you work with in the process. Co-creation is fabulous, and I think this is international across all cultures. If people get involved in the process, there is this sense of engagement and being part of the process, which will really facilitate compliance. So not only are you making sure it's culturally relevant, but you're also making sure they were part of the process in building this. And I think the third one is, and it relates to the first one, is don't spend too much time thinking about the core central piece and making it perfect to what your standard of perfection is before you go into the markets, and sort of make sure that all of those work together hand in hand.
And do you think with this year's changes in business practices and the increased use of technology and people collaborating more via Zoom and so forth, that process has been massaged and that people are getting to understand cultural nuances more effectively?
It's a good question. I'm not sure if it's made a difference. I think we all work on similar time zones when we shouldn't. That's one thing that is for sure. But I don't know. I think communication has been improved a lot and across teams internally. And this goes between countries because people take the time to speak, as we are all quite isolated in our own homes, working behind our computers. So there has been a bit more of a conversation going. It doesn't change that the overall process and way of thinking through the projects to bring the insights at the right time in the process might not be there just yet.
So what baby steps do you think heads of internal comms or employee engagement can take with their board or leaders to make sure that leaders sit up and pay attention to this valuable advice you're giving? How would you advise our comms professionals here to make sure that they're heard?
I think horror stories, as you were mentioning, are a really good way. The fear factor always works very well. It's showcasing what others, or even best practice, obviously, but it's showcasing what other businesses have done well and why it's working. I think nowadays it's all about being authentic and really having meaningful conversations with people in general and meaningful messages. And I think there are more and more cases out there of companies who've done it really, really well. And it's actually working out for them. I was actually speaking to someone this week about, going back to your topic earlier on, how do you build a corporate culture working from home? And I was making the analogy between the country culture and the business culture, because effectively they follow the same dynamics. And they both influence behavior. So you're effectively talking to a peer of people who belong to something, they belong to a group or a community. And you're storing some values that people then adhere to and follow. Working from home for corporate culture is the same as being an expat. And I've been in the UK for 15 years, despite being French. And I see this, thinking, how does your country, and I guess it's the same for Lara, how does your country still influence you? How are you, do you feel this sense of belonging and you share values with people when everything that you see on a daily basis is a completely different setup and different culture? So it's trying to set up those values very earlier in the process and making sure that people adhere to them.
And what resources would you say to point people towards? And I didn't prep you to ask this question, but I'm interested. What do you think people could learn from? I mean, I always go to TED Talks, but any other influences that inspire you to really help deepen your understanding of cultural differences?
I think it depends in what layer of the organization and what topic. One good platform I would recommend is called THT, and it's a consultancy that Fons Trompreneurs has started quite a few decades ago. He's one of the cross-cultural management gurus, and in terms of leadership or managing teams from different backgrounds, him and Ofsede have developed different theories around this, but he's got really good apps actually that you can download and that really make you understand cultural differences within teams, leadership, and different types of areas of strategy. and you can benchmark them against each other, and it's actually quite good. It's a really good, really good tool.
Chat for us as well, in case anybody didn't catch that. Just drop it.
I'm just about to pop it in there.
Okay, great stuff. And same question to Lara, actually. Are there any resources or go-tos that you would recommend for helping to understand cultural nuance? Or
honestly, not off the top of my head. I think that you know, the access and education on employer engagement and internal communication and relations it absolutely does lack. So I don't have, you know, a specific resource to point you in the direction of. The only other thing I would add to, you know, what Mel was saying is I think that all stakeholders, like alignment is so overlooked from, you know, board down. And I think that, you know, a really effective and cohesive company and brand is one where everyone knows the values, the mission, and you can just see workflow, you know, happen more effectively. That's the only other thing I would add. But sorry, I'll come back to you and think of it.
Right, no, just if it was on the tip of your tongue. But we've got just a couple of minutes left, and there's quite a few things to wrap up. But Mel, thank you so much for your insight. And I'm sure after this, if anybody wants to connect via LinkedIn with any of our speakers, they'll be happy to continue the conversation. But Liam, do we want to, we've got 2 minutes to wrap up. So do you have some wise words to finish?
I was just going to, well, the one thing I was going to ask is if Lindsay was happy to tell us a little bit about the book Culture Map, and to see if that was something that she wanted to share with us. That was very interesting. And there was also a couple of other thoughts that have come up about the importance of really understanding your stakeholders. Lou had quite an interesting observation to make there about understanding as well. So Lindsay, did you want to tell us about that book? And Lou, did you want to share with us about stakeholders?
Hi everyone. I don't know if you can see in the camera, but this is my copy of the Culture Map. It was recommended to me by an EMEA president that I worked fairly closely with. I was working in a team and we were involved quite heavily with some colleagues in Israel, and I was finding communication particularly difficult, simply because our colleagues in Israel were very, very direct, particularly when giving feedback, which contradicts our style here in the UK, where we tend to waffle a little bit with feedback. And Charlie recommended the book to me, and it absolutely changed the way that I would communicate with people from different cultures all over the world. And I just cannot recommend it highly enough to anybody who's working cross cultures. It looks at communication, persuasion, negotiation, giving feedback, leading teams, and it addresses so many different sort of cultural differences, and how by having empathy and understanding for other ways of doing something and other perspectives, you can adapt your style. And it's a fabulous book, so I thoroughly recommend that.
That's a glowing review, and I'd love you to write a book review, and then we'll happily all share it through our channels. So, get writing. 500 words on that book, please.
Christmas Hanukkah presents there. So Annabel, do you want to wrap up now?
Yes, I do. I want to thank everybody for coming along on Thursday evening on this dark day, on the day that we'll announce which tier we're in the UK. And to thank our guests, of course, Lara, Ruby and Melanie, for your contribution. Please do feel free to link in with each other, capture names and make sure you continue the conversation. We'll be sending out a 2-question pulse check in time-honoured tradition, just to get your feedback on tonight's event. And date for your diary. We would love to see you on the 17th of December, 5 to 6 p.m. And we're going to be doing a wrap-up of the year, or a review. And we've already got our 3 speakers lined up, 3 guests. And we're going to be looking at innovation in light of COVID, the big news stories of the year. So obviously COVID, Black Lives Matter, the change of presidency, and also diversity and inclusion agenda and how that's shifted or not in 2020. So look out for the recording of this that will be shared by Kiri at PRCA. Thanks, Kiri, for hosting tonight. And happy Thanksgiving to Lara and all our American friends, friends and family that you might have. Hope you have a smashing supper tonight. And Good night, everybody, and see you on the 17th. Bring a drink on the 17th and wear something silly if you fancy.